The dust kicked up around Grace Sullivan's boots as she ran through the narrow canyon pass, her breath coming in ragged gasps that burned her throat with each desperate inhale. Behind her, somewhere in the twisted maze of red rock and scrub brush, she could hear the distant shouts of men who wanted to claim the $500 reward her ex-husband had placed on her head for the crime of leaving him alive instead of staying to become another victim of his fists. It was September of 1876, and the Arizona Territory was unforgiving to women who dared to choose freedom over a wedding ring stained with blood and broken promises. She had made it as far as a trading post on the edge of nowhere when she saw the poster tacked to the weathered wood beside the door. Her own face stared back at her from the crude sketch, younger looking than she felt after 3 years of marriage to Marcus Crenshaw, with the word "wanted" printed in bold letters above her name and a description that painted her as a thief and a runaway wife. The lies made her stomach turn, but the amount of money offered made her knees weak. $500 was enough to make even honest men consider betraying their principles. Grace pulled her hat lower over her dark blonde hair and kept her eyes down as she entered the post, praying that the proprietor had not studied the poster too closely. She needed supplies, water, and information about the nearest town where she might disappear into anonymity. The man behind the counter barely glanced at her as she gathered what little she could afford with the money she had sewn into the lining of her dress before fleeing in the middle of the night 2 weeks ago. As she stepped back into the harsh sunlight, counting the coins she had left, a tall figure moved between her and her horse. Grace's hand instinctively went to the small pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt, but she froze when she saw what the man was doing. He had torn the wanted poster from the wall and was striking a match against the post, holding the flame to the corner of the paper until it caught and curled into ash. "That poster is a lie," he said, his voice low and steady as he watched the flames consume her face. "Any man who puts a bounty on his wife for leaving him is not a man at all." Grace stared at him, unable to form words as the last of the poster crumbled to black flakes that scattered in the desert wind. The stranger was perhaps 25, with dark hair that fell to his collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer. He wore the clothes of a working cowboy, trail-worn and practical, with a gun belt slung low on his hips that spoke of someone who knew how to use the weapon but did not draw it for pleasure. "You don't know me," Grace finally managed, her voice hoarse from days of rationing water and swallowing dust. "You don't know if that poster tells the truth." "I know enough," he replied, dropping the last burning corner and grinding it under his boot heel. "I know Marcus Crenshaw, and I know the kind of man he is. I worked his ranch for 3 months before I saw what he did to you and quit. My name is Thomas Irving, and if you need help getting somewhere safe, I have a horse, and I know these territories." The relief that flooded through Grace was so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. She had been alone for so long, first in her marriage and then in her flight, that the simple offer of help from a stranger who asked nothing in return felt like water in the desert. But caution had kept her alive this long, and she could not afford to trust too easily. "Why would you help me?" she asked, studying his face for any sign of deception. "That poster means money, more money than most men see in a year." "Why burn it?" Thomas met her gaze without flinching. "Because some things matter more than money. I have a sister back in Kansas. If she ever needed to run from a man like Crenshaw, I would hope someone would help her instead of turning her in for bounty. Besides, I have been heading toward California anyway. Sonora is about 2 weeks' ride from here, up in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Gold country. Easy enough to disappear in a mining town where people come and go every day." Grace wanted to believe him. Every instinct screamed that she should take her horse and ride in the opposite direction, trusting no one. But exhaustion was making her bones ache and her judgment cloudy. She had perhaps 3 days of supplies left, and she had no clear plan beyond putting as much distance between herself and Marcus as possible. "I can't pay you," she said quietly. "I have almost nothing left. I am not asking for payment." Thomas gestured toward the horses. "But we should move. If I saw that poster, others have too, and Crenshaw has probably hired men to track you. We can make it to the border of California in 4 days if we ride hard and stick to the less traveled routes." Against the screaming voice of self-preservation in her head, Grace nodded. She mounted her horse, a sturdy mare she had bought from a sympathetic rancher's wife who had seen the bruises on her arms and asked no questions, and followed Thomas Irving away from the trading post and deeper into the wilderness that stretched between her past and whatever uncertain future awaited. They rode in silence for the first few hours, following dry creek beds and narrow passes that hid them from anyone traveling the main roads. Thomas set a steady pace that covered ground without exhausting the horses, and he seemed to know instinctively where water could be found and which trails would offer the most cover. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, he led them to a small canyon with a spring that bubbled up from between the rocks. "We will camp here tonight," he said, dismounting and leading his horse to the water. "There are caves in the canyon walls that will hide a fire, and we can see anyone approaching from either direction." Grace slid from her saddle, her legs trembling from the long ride. She had grown soft during her marriage, confined to the ranch house and forbidden from doing anything that Marcus considered unladylike. The journey had already stripped away that softness, leaving behind someone harder and more determined than the girl who had married at 18, believing that love was supposed to hurt a little. As Thomas set about making camp with the efficient movements of someone who had spent more nights under the stars than under a roof, Grace gathered kindling and tried to make herself useful. She was acutely aware that she knew very little about surviving in the wilderness, but she was a quick learner and stubborn enough to figure things out through trial and error. "You said you worked for Marcus," she ventured as they sat beside the small fire, eating the simple meal of beans and dried meat that Thomas had pulled from his saddlebags. "I don't remember seeing you at the ranch." "I worked mostly with the cattle, out on the range," Thomas said, staring into the flames. "But I came back to the house one day to report to Crenshaw about some losses to rustlers. You were in the kitchen, and he was angry about something. Burned food, I think. He hit you hard enough to knock you down, and when you tried to stand, he kicked you. I saw the whole thing through the window." Grace felt her face grow hot with shame and anger. She had become so accustomed to hiding the violence that having someone speak of it so plainly made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "Why did you quit?" "Because I told him if I ever saw him touch you like that again, I would kill him. He laughed and said you were his wife and he could do what he wanted. I packed my gear that night and left." Thomas looked up from the fire, his expression serious. "I should have done more. I should have helped you then." "There was nothing you could have done," Grace said softly. "I was not ready to leave yet. I kept thinking he would change, that if I could just be better or quieter or more perfect, he would stop. It took me 2 more years to realize that nothing I did would ever be enough because the problem was not me." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant cry of a coyote. Grace found herself studying Thomas in the flickering light, noticing details she had missed in her panic earlier. He had kind eyes, the sort that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and his hands were calloused from hard work but gentle when he handled the horses. There was something steady about him, an unshakable quality that made her feel safer than she had felt in years. "Tell me about Sonora," she said, needing to break the silence before her thoughts wandered into dangerous territory. "What is it like?" Thomas leaned back against his saddle, his expression thoughtful. "I passed through once, about a year ago." It was a mining camp during the gold rush, back in '48, but it has grown into a proper town now. Lots of people from all over, including Mexico, which is how it got the name. The mines are still working, though the easy gold is long gone. But that means there are stores and hotels and churches. A person could start over there and no one would think twice about it. "A person could start over," Grace repeated, tasting the words like something fragile and precious. "I have been running for so long that I had almost forgotten there might be an ending where I get to stop and build something instead of just hiding." "You will get there," Thomas said with conviction. "I promise you that." The next 3 days passed in a blur of riding and camping, always moving northwest toward California and the promise of safety. Thomas proved to be excellent company, neither talking too much nor falling into uncomfortable silence. He told her stories about his childhood in Kansas, about his parents who had homesteaded during the worst of the border conflicts, and taught their children that courage meant standing up for what was right even when it cost you something. Grace found herself opening up in return, sharing pieces of her life that she had kept locked away for so long. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, the daughter of a seamstress who had died when Grace was 15, leaving her alone and vulnerable. Marcus had seemed like salvation when he came to the city on business, a successful rancher who promised her security and a home. She had been too young and desperate to see the warning signs, the way he isolated her from anyone who might help, the gradual escalation from harsh words to rougher hands. "I killed who I used to be when I left him," Grace admitted one evening as they made camp beside a stream that ran clear and cold from the mountains ahead. "The girl who believed in fairy tales and happy endings died the first time he hit me. I don't know who I am now." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands still as he worked on repairing a broken bridle. "Maybe you get to decide who you are now. Maybe that is the gift of leaving, even if it came with a terrible price. You get to become someone new." His words settled into her chest like seeds waiting for the right conditions to grow. That night, as she lay in her bedroll staring up at the vast sweep of stars, Grace let herself imagine a future beyond survival. She pictured herself in Sonora, perhaps working in a shop or taking in sewing like her mother had done. She pictured a small house with a garden and a front porch where she could sit in the evening without fear. And though she tried not to let the thought fully form, she pictured Thomas Irving in that future, his steady presence a constant she had not known she needed until it appeared. On the 4th day, they crossed into California and began the climb into the Sierra Nevada foothills. The landscape changed from desert scrub to pine forests, and the air grew cooler and scented with resin and earth. Grace breathed deeply, feeling something in her chest unclenching for the first time since she had fled into the night with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate hope that she might survive. They were less than a day's ride from Sonora when trouble found them. The riders appeared as they descended into a valley where a dirt road wound between stands of oak trees. There were 4 of them, rough-looking men with guns, and the kind of eyes that saw people as commodities rather than human beings. Grace recognized the type immediately, bounty hunters or worse, men who would happily turn her over to Marcus for the reward money. "Thomas Irving," the leader called out, a stocky man with a scar running from his eyebrow to his jaw. "I heard you were traveling these parts." "That woman with you matches the description of a fugitive wanted by Marcus Crenshaw down in Arizona," We will be taking her back now." Thomas moved his horse to block Grace from the men, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture that was more threat than relaxation. "The poster was a lie, and you have no authority to take anyone anywhere. Move aside and let us pass." The scarred man laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Crenshaw is paying $500 for her return, and that kind of money buys a lot of authority. Now, you can step aside peaceful-like, or we can make this difficult. Your choice." Grace felt her heart hammering against her ribs, her mouth dry with fear. She had come so far, survived so much, and the thought of being dragged back to Marcus made her stomach turn with nausea. Her hand moved toward the small pistol hidden in her skirt, but Thomas caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "I am going to make you a counter-offer," Thomas said, his voice calm despite the tension crackling in the air. "You are going to turn your horses around and ride back the way you came. You are going to forget you ever saw us, and in exchange, I will not kill you." The bounty hunters exchanged glances, clearly not expecting resistance. The scarred man's expression hardened, his hand moving toward his gun. "That is 4 against 1, Cowboy. I don't like your odds." "4 against 2, Grace said, pulling her pistol free and pointing it with shaking hands at the nearest rider. "And I would rather die here than go back to that monster." For a long moment, no one moved. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which way the violence would break. Then Thomas drew his gun with a speed that made Grace blink, the barrel leveled at the scarred man's chest before any of the bounty hunters could clear leather. "Last chance," Thomas said quietly. "Ride away." Perhaps it was the steadiness in Thomas's voice, or the desperate determination in Grace's eyes, or simply the calculation that $500 was not worth dying for, but the scarred man slowly raised his hands away from his gun. "This is not over. Crenshaw will send more men." "Then they will face the same choice you are facing now," Thomas replied. "Grace Sullivan is under my protection, and anyone who tries to take her will answer to me. Spread that word when you get back to Arizona." The bounty hunters wheeled their horses and rode back down the valley, their curses and threats fading into the distance. Grace waited until they were out of sight before lowering her pistol, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Thomas holstered his gun and moved his horse close to hers, his hand reaching out to steady her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes searching her face. "I have never pointed a gun at anyone before," Grace whispered. "I don't know if I could have pulled the trigger." "You did not have to, and that is what matters. But Grace, they were right about one thing. Crenshaw will send more men. A man like him does not give up easily, especially when his pride is wounded." Thomas paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "When we get to Sonora, you should stay close to me, at least until we know you are safe." Grace nodded, too shaken to argue. They rode the rest of the way in silence, finally emerging from the forest as the sun began to set. Spread out before them in the valley was Sonora, a collection of wooden buildings and mine works that had grown into a bustling town. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from a distance, Grace could hear the sounds of civilization, voices and music, and the clatter of wagons on the main street. They found rooms at a modest hotel, run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, whose family had come from China during the gold rush and stayed to build a life in the Sierra foothills. She asked no questions when Thomas paid for 2 separate rooms, simply handed them keys and pointed them toward a dining room where supper was being served. Grace stood in her room after Thomas had gone to his own, staring at the small bed and washstand and chair that represented more luxury than she had known in weeks. She washed the trail dust from her face and hands, changed into the one clean dress she had packed, and tried to calm the racing of her heart. She was safe, at least for now. She had made it to California, to a town where she could disappear into the crowd of miners and merchants and dreamers seeking their fortunes. But as she sat on the edge of the bed, Grace realized that she did not want to disappear. She did not want to spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, jumping at shadows, afraid that Marcus would find her. And more than that, she did not want to say goodbye to Thomas Irving, the man who had torn down a bounty poster and burned it because he believed some things mattered more than money. A soft knock at her door made her jump. She opened it to find Thomas standing in the hallway, cleaned up and looking uncertain in a way that made him seem younger than his years. "I wanted to make sure you were settled," he said, "and to talk about what happens next." Grace stepped back to let him in, leaving the door open for propriety's sake. "What do you think should happen next?" Thomas ran a hand through his damp hair, a gesture of nervousness that Grace found endearing. "I have been thinking about what those bounty hunters said. About Crenshaw sending more men. The only way you will ever truly be safe is if you are not Grace Sullivan anymore." Her stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I mean you need a new name, a new identity. And the best way to do that, the way that will protect you legally and make it clear to Crenshaw that he has no claim on you, is to marry someone else." Thomas met her eyes, his expression serious. "I am offering to marry you, Grace. Not because I expect anything from you, but because it is the right thing to do. We could make it a marriage of convenience, just on paper, and you would be free to live your own life however you choose." Grace stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. Marriage had been a prison for her, chains that bound her to a man who hurt her and laws that said she had no right to leave. The thought of entering into that arrangement again, even with someone kind like Thomas, made her feel sick with panic. "I can see you are afraid," Thomas said gently. "And I understand why, but this would not be like your marriage to Crenshaw. You would have your own room, your own money, your own choices. I would ask nothing from you except to let me help keep you safe." "Why?" Grace asked, the question bursting out of her. "Why would you do this? What do you get from it?" Thomas was quiet for a long time, his gaze dropping to the floor. When he looked up again, there was something vulnerable in his eyes that made Grace's breath catch. "Because in the weeks we have been traveling together, I have come to care about you. Not as a woman who needs rescuing, but as a person who is brave and strong and deserves a chance to build the life she wants. And if I am being honest, I have come to care about you in other ways too, ways that I have no right to feel given everything you have been through. But I would never ask you to return those feelings. I just want to help." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. She had been so focused on survival, on running and hiding and staying one step ahead of Marcus, that she had not allowed herself to feel anything beyond fear and determination. But Thomas's words cracked something open inside her, and she realized that she cared about him too. She cared about his kindness and his steady presence. She cared about the way he listened when she spoke and never made her feel small or foolish. She cared about the future he was offering, not as a jailer but as a partner. "What if I said I want more than a marriage of convenience?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I said that I have feelings for you too, but I am terrified because the last time I trusted a man with my heart, he broke me?" Thomas crossed the small room in 2 strides, taking her hands in his. His touch was warm and gentle, nothing like the grabbing, bruising hold she had learned to fear. "Then, I would say we take it as slow as you need. I would say that you set the boundaries and I will respect them. I would say that I am willing to wait as long as it takes for you to feel safe, because you are worth waiting for." Grace looked up into his creek water eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and hope. She thought about the man who had torn down a wanted poster and burned it because he believed she deserved better. She thought about the weeks they had spent traveling together, the way he had never once made her feel afraid or pressured or less than human. She thought about the future she had imagined, and how in every version Thomas was there. "Ask me again," she said. "Ask me to marry you not just for safety but for real." Thomas's face transformed, hope and joy and something tender lighting his features. He squeezed her hands gently. "Grace Sullivan, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I promise to respect you and protect you and never raise a hand to you in anger. I promise to be your partner in building whatever life we want together. And I promise to spend every day trying to deserve the gift of your trust." "Yes," Grace said, tears streaming down her face now, but they were tears of relief and hope rather than pain. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed 3 days later in a small church on the edge of Sonora, with Mrs. Chen and the minister's wife standing as witnesses. Grace wore a simple blue dress that she had purchased with the last of her money, and Thomas wore his best shirt and a nervous smile that made Grace's heart feel too large for her chest. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her gently on the forehead, a chaste touch that held a promise of patience and respect. They rented a small house on the outskirts of town, a 2-room cabin with a porch and a view of the pine-covered mountains. Thomas found work at a ranch about 5 miles away, riding out each morning and returning in the evening with the smell of horses and honest labor clinging to him. Grace took in sewing and mending, discovering that she had inherited more of her mother's skill with a needle than she had realized. The first weeks of their marriage were tentative, both of them learning the rhythms of living together. True to his word, Thomas never pressured her or made her feel trapped. He slept on a bedroll in the main room while Grace took the bedroom, and he was always careful to knock before entering any space she occupied. He asked her opinion on everything from what to have for supper to how to spend their money, treating her as an equal partner rather than property. Grace found herself slowly relaxing, the constant tension that had lived in her shoulders for 3 years gradually easing. She began to smile more often, to laugh at Thomas's stories about the ranch hands and their various misadventures. She started to trust that, when he said he would be home before dark, he would be there. No angry interrogations or accusations about where she had been or who she had spoken to. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Grace reached out and took Thomas's hand. He startled at the contact, his eyes going wide with surprise. "I have been thinking," Grace said, her thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand. "About what you said when you proposed, about taking things slow and letting me set the boundaries." "Yes," Thomas's voice was cautious, hopeful. "I want to move forward, not all at once, but in small steps. I want to share more of my life with you because you have shown me what marriage should be. You have shown me that love does not have to hurt." Grace took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I want to kiss you, really kiss you, is that all right?" Thomas turned to face her fully, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with infinite gentleness. "That is more than all right. But Grace, if you change your mind at any point, if you need to stop or slow down, you just say so. No questions, no anger, no consequences. You are in control of this." Grace leaned forward, closing the distance between them until her lips met his. The kiss was soft and sweet, nothing like the demanding, possessive kisses Marcus had forced on her. Thomas kissed her like she was precious, like he was savoring every moment, and Grace felt something warm unfurling in her chest. When they finally pulled apart, she was breathless and smiling. "That was nice," she said, then laughed at the understatement. "Actually, that was wonderful." Thomas grinned. the expression transforming his usually serious face into something boyish and charming. "I have wanted to do that since the first day I saw you in the trading post, looking fierce and afraid and so incredibly brave. But I am glad we waited until you were ready." They moved slowly, carefully, building trust and intimacy at a pace that never made Grace feel overwhelmed. Thomas continued to sleep in the main room until one cold November night when Grace appeared in the doorway and asked if he would hold her. He wrapped her in his arms and they lay together on her bed, fully clothed and simply finding comfort in each other's presence. It was another month before Grace felt ready to take that final step, to make their marriage real in every sense of the word, and when it happened, it was nothing like her experiences with Marcus. Thomas was patient and gentle, checking in with her constantly, making sure she felt safe and desired rather than used. In the spring of 1877, Grace discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complicated tangle of emotions, joy mixed with fear and memories of the miscarriage she had suffered after Marcus had beaten her during the first year of their marriage. She had never told Thomas about that loss, had kept it locked away with all the other painful secrets she carried. But when she told him about the baby, his reaction was pure delight. He swept her into a careful embrace, his hand coming to rest protectively over her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a child," he said, wonder in his voice. "Grace, you have made me the happiest man alive." His joy eased some of her fear, but not all of it. That night, as they lay in bed, Grace finally told him about the baby she had lost, about the beating that had caused it and the way Marcus had blamed her for being weak. Thomas held her as she cried, his own tears falling into her hair. "I am so sorry you went through that alone. I am sorry that monster made you believe it was your fault when it was never anything but his cruelty. But this baby will be different, I promise you. I will protect both of you with everything I have." The pregnancy was not easy. Grace suffered from terrible sickness in the early months and constant fear that something would go wrong. Thomas was patient and attentive, bringing her tea and crackers when she could not keep anything else down, rubbing her aching back, talking to her belly and telling their child stories about the life they would build together. In November of 1877, after 12 hours of labor that left Grace exhausted and terrified, their son was born. Thomas cut the cord with shaking hands and placed the squalling infant on Grace's chest, his face wet with tears of joy. They named him Samuel Thomas Irving, and Grace fell in love all over again as she watched her husband cradle their tiny son with the same gentleness he had always shown her. Life settled into a new rhythm after Samuel's birth. Thomas continued working at the ranch while Grace managed their home and cared for their son. Money was sometimes tight, but they had enough, and more importantly, they had each other. Samuel grew into a bright, curious toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's determination. On a warm afternoon in June of 1879, Grace was hanging laundry in the yard while Samuel played with wooden blocks on a blanket, when a rider appeared on the road. Her heart seized with old fear, but as the figure drew closer, she realized it was a woman, dusty from travel and riding a horse that had clearly covered many miles. The woman dismounted and removed her hat, revealing dark hair streaked with gray and a face lined with exhaustion. "I am looking for Grace Sullivan," she said. "I was told she might be in these parts." Grace's hand went instinctively to the pistol Thomas had taught her to shoot, the weapon she kept tucked in her apron now that she had a child to protect. "Who is asking?" "My name is Margaret Crenshaw. I am Marcus's mother." The woman raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "Please, I am not here to cause trouble. I need to speak with you about my son." Grace's mind raced, trying to understand what this could mean. She had never met Marcus's mother, had been told the woman lived back east and wanted nothing to do with her son's marriage. What about him? Margaret's face crumpled with grief. He is dead. 3 months ago. Got into a fight with one of his ranch hands, a man he accused of stealing. Pulled his gun, but the other man was faster. Marcus died instantly. The words hung in the air between them. Grace waited for relief, for triumph, for something beyond the strange numbness that settled over her. Marcus was dead. The monster who had haunted her nightmares could not hurt her anymore. "Why come here to tell me?" Grace asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Because I found things when I was settling his affairs. Wanted posters with your face on them. Letters to bounty hunters. Evidence of the kind of man my son really was." Margaret's voice broke. "I knew he had problems, anger issues that started after his father died. But I told myself they were not that bad, that he would outgrow them. I failed you by not seeing the truth, and I failed him by not getting him help before he became a monster. I came to apologize and to tell you that you never have to look over your shoulder again. The bounty is gone, along with any legal claim he had on you." Grace felt her legs go weak. She sank onto the porch steps, processing the enormity of what she was hearing. Freedom. Real freedom, not just the fragile safety of distance and a new name, but the permanent kind that came from knowing her tormentor was gone. "I don't know what to say," Grace admitted. "I spent so long being afraid of him, hating him, running from him, and now he is just gone." Margaret sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "You owe him nothing, not even the grace of forgiveness. I am not asking you to mourn him or pretend he was anything other than what he was. I just wanted you to know that you are free, and I am sorry for all the ways my family failed you." Samuel toddled over, curious about the stranger, and Grace lifted him onto her lap. "This is my son, Samuel, and I have a husband now, a good man who has never raised a hand to me in anger. I built a new life, and Marcus has no place in it, not even as a ghost to fear." "Then I am glad," Margaret said simply. "You deserved better than what my son gave you, and it sounds like you found it." They talked for a while longer, Margaret sharing what little she knew about the legal dissolution of Grace's first marriage and the dispersal of Marcus's estate. When she finally mounted her horse to leave, Grace felt a chapter of her life closing with a finality that was both strange and liberating. Thomas came home that evening to find Grace sitting on the porch with Samuel sleeping in her arms, staring out at the mountains with an expression of wonder on her face. He sat down beside her, his arm coming around her shoulders. "Something happened today," Grace said, and told him everything about Margaret's visit and Marcus's death. When she finished, Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "How do you feel, free?" Grace said, testing the word. "For the first time since I was 15 years old, I feel completely and truly free. Not because he is dead, though that helps, but because I realize today that I have not thought about him in weeks. I have been so focused on building our life, on loving you and raising Samuel, that he stopped mattering. I survived him, and more than that, I thrived after him." Thomas kissed her forehead. "You are the strongest person I have ever known, and I am honored to spend my life watching you thrive." The years that followed were good ones. Grace and Thomas had 2 more children, a daughter they named Clara in 1881 and another son, Henry, in 1884. Thomas eventually saved enough money to buy a small ranch of their own. Nothing grand, but enough land to run a modest herd of cattle and build the kind of life they had both dreamed about. Grace's sewing business grew as well, and she became known throughout Sonora for her skill with difficult repairs and beautiful embroidery. She taught Clara to sew, passing down her mother's skills to a new generation, and she taught Samuel and Henry to shoot and ride and stand up for what was right, just as Thomas had taught her. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Grace and Thomas would sit on the porch of their house and watch the sun set over the mountains. They would hold hands and talk about their days, sharing the small triumphs and challenges that made up a life. And Grace would think about the scared woman who had run through the desert with a bounty on her head, about the cowboy who had torn down that poster and burned it because he believed she deserved better. She thought about how love should never hurt, how trust was something that had to be earned and protected, how freedom was worth any price. She thought about the family they had built together, the children they were raising to be kind and strong and unafraid to stand up against injustice. And she thought about the future that stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and hope. In the summer of 1890, when Samuel was almost 13 and preparing to take on more responsibility at the ranch, he asked his parents how they had met. Grace and Thomas exchanged a look, years of shared history passing between them in that single glance. "Your father saved my life," Grace said simply. "Not just once, but every day since, by showing me what real love looks like." Thomas shook his head, his hand finding Grace's and lacing their fingers together in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Your mother saved herself. I just had the privilege of being there to witness her courage and the honor of building a life beside her." Samuel seemed satisfied with this answer, his young mind not yet ready for the full truth of his mother's past or the darkness she had escaped. That would come later, when he was old enough to understand the complexities of the world and the importance of standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. As the sun set and the children wandered off to their evening chores, Grace leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder and felt the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. She thought about all the miles she had traveled, both literal and metaphorical, from that terrified woman in the desert to the contented mother and wife sitting on this porch. The journey had been hard and sometimes painful, but it had led her here to this moment, to this life that she had built with her own two hands and the help of a man who believed some things mattered more than money. The bounty poster was long gone, reduced to ash and scattered by desert winds. But the love between Grace and Thomas remained, strong and true and tested by time and hardship. They had built something beautiful together, a family and a home and a future that shone brighter than any gold the miners of Sonora could pull from the earth. And if sometimes Grace woke in the night from dreams of the past, Thomas was always there to hold her and remind her that she was safe, that she was loved, that she had survived and thrived and created a legacy that had nothing to do with the man who had tried to break her. She was Grace Irving now, wife and mother and businesswoman, and the woman who had run through the desert with a bounty on her head was just a chapter in her story, not the whole book. As the years turned into decades, their love only deepened. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, mourned losses and celebrated victories, raised their children and eventually welcomed grandchildren into their home. Samuel grew up to be a rancher like his father, marrying a kind woman from Sacramento and giving Grace and Thomas two beautiful grandchildren. Clara became a teacher, dedicating her life to education and helping children learn to read and write. Henry followed his mother's business sense, opening a store in Sonora that became a cornerstone of the community. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1902, Thomas and Grace stood on the same porch where they had shared their first real kiss all those years ago. Their hair was streaked with gray now, their hands marked by the years of work and struggle and triumph, but their love was as strong as ever. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked, his arm around her waist. saying yes to a stranger who offered you marriage as protection. Grace turned to face him, her hands coming up to frame his weathered face. Not for a single moment. You gave me back my life, Thomas Irving. You gave me freedom and safety and love. You gave me children and a home and a future I could never have imagined when I was running through that desert. You gave me everything. You gave me just as much, Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. You taught me what courage really means. You showed me that love is not about possession or control, but about partnership and respect. You gave me a family and a purpose, and a reason to be the best man I could be. Every day with you has been a gift. They kissed then, long and deep and full of 25 years of shared history and love that had weathered every storm. And as the sun set over the California mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace Sullivan Irving knew that she had finally found what she had been searching for all those years ago when she fled into the night with nothing but hope and determination. She had found home. Not a place, but a person. Not safety, but love. Not an ending to her story, but a beginning that stretched forward into a future full of light and promise, and the steady, unshakable presence of a man who had torn down a wanted poster and burned it because he believed she deserved better than the price someone had put on her head. And she had proven him right, building a life that was worth more than any bounty, any reward, any amount of gold that could be pulled from the Sierra Nevada mountains. She had proven that a woman who ran could also stand and fight and build and love. She had proven that the past did not have to define the future, that darkness could give way to light, that even the most broken hearts could heal given time and patience and the right person to help hold the pieces together. Grace Irving had started her journey as a woman with a bounty on her head, running from a monster who wanted to drag her back into captivity. She ended it as a woman surrounded by family and love, with roots that ran deep into the California soil and a legacy that would outlive her by generations. And it had all started with a cowboy who saw a wanted poster and decided that some things mattered more than money, that human dignity was worth protecting, and that sometimes the greatest act of heroism was simply choosing to do the right thing when no one was watching. Their story became legend in Sonora, passed down through generations as a testament to the power of courage and love and standing up for what was right. Children grew up hearing about the woman who ran from evil and the cowboy who helped her find freedom, about how love should never hurt and how the right partner could help heal even the deepest wounds. And though the details sometimes shifted with each retelling, the heart of the story remained true. A reminder that even in the harsh landscape of the Wild West, kindness and compassion could flourish and love could conquer all.